Hello everyone, welcome back to the second round of the Superbet Romania Chess Classic. Today we had extremely exciting games with just one victory and 4 draws, but we had very exciting games. So without further ado, let's get right into the action. The first game we're going to be taking a look at is between Alireza Firouzja and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. This was the only decisive game of the round, where Alireza won with the white pieces, making a comeback after his loss in the first round versus Fabiano Caruana. Today, once again playing with the white pieces, Alireza goes for d4. Nodirbek replies with the Slav defense, to which Firouzja goes for the solid exchange Slav variation. This variation has been popular at all levels for a very solid play, but at the same time hoping to outplay the black in a very symmetrical pawn structure. Knight f6, e3, knight c6. This is pretty standard, and usually white players opt for moves like knight c3 or knight f3, but Alireza played the lesser played move, bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king. Bishop d7, knight went to c3, pawn went to a6, bishop dropped back to e2, and e6 was played by black. So after the bishop went to e5 and then went back to e2, what he actually achieved was somehow forcing black to play the move e6 and locking the bishop on d7. White just kept his development with knight f3, bishop e7, and he played the move h3, so that he has the bishop h2 square available in case black plays the move knight h5. Short castles, queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2, and here white played the move a3. Notice that queen takes b2 would actually be a very bad move because of the move knight a4, trapping the queen on b2, since the a3 pawn is covering the b4 square and the rest of the squares are controlled by other white pieces. So that would win the queen. After a3, rook fc8 was played. White played knight a4 and then b4, starting an attack on the queen side. Black responded with b6, queen b3, trying to bring the rook to c1 perhaps. Knight e4, bishop d3, queen b7, and here white took the knight on e4, which is a big decision. White is giving up the bishop pair, but he is aiming to pick this pawn on e4 in the future if black allows it. And here black played the move b5, which attacks the knight on a4, but gives up the c5 square where white can land his knight. A possibility for black was to play the move knight a7, protecting this pawn on e4 and allowing the attack on the a4 knight with the bishop and having a solid position. But instead, black played this move b5, attacking the knight. White replied with knight c3, hoping to win the pawn in the near future, and black simply played the move a5, trying to attack the queen side, ignoring this pawn on e4. Black certainly could have, and probably should have, played the move f5, defending the pawn, but maybe they were worried slightly about the king position with this long diagonal a2, g8, opening up potentially after things like d5, or f3 opening up the f file, and so on. So black played the move a5 instead, which is attacking the pawn on b4, but white captured knight takes e4 in this position. Here, black played the move rook a6, could have considered the move a takes b4, but they might have missed this move, which is bishop to d6, attacking the pawn on b4, and if you take my bishop, I can play the move knight takes d6, hitting the queen, hitting the rook, winning some material. And if you take on a3, let's say with pawn takes a3, then I can take your knight, take your bishop, knight takes, and then knight d6. Still wins the material. And if you want to do the similar, rook takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, knight takes, and then knight d6. Also wins the exchange, probably the game later. So this is probably what black missed in the game. and therefore this whole b5, a5 idea is not the greatest idea of the position. So perhaps knight a7 was better, or after b5, knight c3, f5 was the better choice. a5 was the first slight inaccuracy from the black side. And after rook a6 was played, which is the decisive inaccuracy, white, after playing knight c5, has a very, very dominant position, especially after bishop c5, bc5. White is up an extra pawn, which is connected pawn, and there is a pressure on the b file, and the position for black is going to collapse slowly. Instead, the better approach would have been to sacrifice another pawn in order to get some activity and also block the diagonal of this bishop, so that after, let's say, d takes e5, I can indeed play a takes b4 in this position, and I have stopped the concept of bishop going to d6 with this temporary pawn sacrifice. But after black missed that move, after a very, very long think, almost a 20-minute think, white had a very comfortable advantage, and up 2 pawns now, and the knight is coming to d6 at this point, not allowing any counterplay on the queen side with a4, making sure everything is locked, defending the pawn with rook c1, and white gave away the exchange, but now has more than enough material plus the passed pawn. So white is dominating in this position, and after black desperately sacrificed the bishop on the king side, trying to do something by exposing the white king, there is absolutely not enough material or counterplay. White simply went on to winning the game. In this position, black resigned simply because he doesn't have anything against the white's king, and white is up material, and therefore Nodirbek resigned. What a comeback by Alireza Firouzja after the loss yesterday. He was completely in a very good shape and had an unfortunate loss, so this win is actually going to motivate him for the upcoming rounds. Very, very big result for Alireza. Our next matchup is the All-American matchup between Fabiano Caruana and Wesley So. And these two players, they have played with each other in many events, and now they're facing each other. So Fabi goes with c4, the English opening, e5 and d3. Slightly less popular move compared to knight to c3 or g3, or perhaps even knight f3. But d3 is also fairly logical. White goes knight f3, knight c6, and a3. Black responds with the move g6. They could have responded with the move d5. This would have been the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian, but with the colors upside down. So white would actually have an extra tempo as opposed to the regular Najdorf variation. So in the game, g6 was played, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, d5, cd5, knight d5, castles, castles, and bishop d2. So both sides are simply developing. I have a feeling that Fabi was just trying to avoid the theoretical battle against Wesley and trying to get some position out of the opening where he can just move his pieces around and just play chess rather than have a theoretical debate. Black goes a5, white develops knight c3, and the knight drops back to f6. Perhaps black could have actually taken on c3 and then played the move a4, stopping any counterplay on the queen side, because b4 would be met by en passant, and black also has ideas like trying to cement the bishop if needed in the future. But Wesley decided to not trade pieces by retreating knight f6. White plays rook c1, both sides are improving their pieces, and white opts for the move knight to b5, putting pressure on the c7 pawn and trying to make sure this knight doesn't go anywhere, because sometimes in the English opening, this knight d4 motifs are typical for the black side. Black plays h6, preventing any piece coming to g5 in case white wanted to go something like knight g5, knight e4, or bishop g5, putting pressure on this diagonal. h6, bishop e3, knight d5, hitting the bishop. Bishop goes to c5, knight goes to b8. Knight is retreating back, but the idea is black can play b6 or c6 in the future. If they played the move b6, in this case, white had this really interesting move, bishop to d6. Temporarily giving up the bishop, but if you take the bishop, I can play rook takes c6, attacking this pawn on d6, and I'm also opening up the diagonal for my bishop on g2, which would be very dangerous. Therefore, black played the move knight to b8 so that they can play b6 on their next move. Noticing that white plays the move e4 and then plays the move a4 afterwards, so that after b6, which was played in the game, white can respond with the move bishop a3. It is move 17, but players had already spent more than an hour and 10 minutes, which shows how complicated this position is indeed. White is attacking the pawn on c7, and black responded with knight a6, perhaps a slight mistake, because after knight a6, white played the move d4, opening up the position and getting a really sharp and good position for white. Instead, black probably should have replied with the move c5, stopping the push of d4, but there are other complications in this position. White can play the move knight takes e5, which is a temporary sacrifice, and after rook takes e5, white can play the move d4, trying to open up this diagonal. In case the rook drops back, white can always look for ideas like e5 in the position and try to hit this rook on a8. So in this position, if black takes on d4, white can take queen takes d4, offering a queen trade, but if you take the queen, I have rook takes c8, which is an intermediate check, and that would allow white to level up the material in a very complicated fashion. So takes, rook d1, attacking the bishop. If the bishop drops anywhere but f6, I can play rook to d8, putting huge pressure. And if you go knight c6, here I can play the move e5. And after a very long and complicated line, white has finally managed to regain the piece. Black can take, white can take, black can take, and material is even. But after rook d8, rook e6, and rook, let's say, first maybe bishop to d6, or perhaps rook b8, we have a very interesting position. Maybe rook b8 is better indeed, and white is doing better due to the activity of his pieces, stronger bishop, and an active rook, as opposed to the rook on e6. So this could have been possible if c5 was played, a very long variation. So not necessarily all of those moves would be played, but it could happen on the board possibly. But black played knight a6, which allowed the move d4. And now the game is extremely exciting. So bishop b7 was played, knight takes on e5, bishop takes e4 was played, bishop takes, and knight takes f7 happened. Black replied with queen to d5, but if black were to recapture this knight, white would have given the check on b3, forcing the black to play the move rook to e6, to which white can reply rook e1, exerting pressure on the e4 knight. If the knight drops back to g5, in this position white can simply attack this knight. There is no check on f3 because the queen is controlling it, and white would be winning since the black king is in extreme danger in this position. Therefore, the knight is not capturable, so black played the move queen to d5, attacking the knight now, forcing white to retreat to e5. Knight went to g5, threatening checkmate on h3. Of course, white saw that, played the move h4. Rook takes e5, sacrifice, d takes e5, knight f3 check, king h1. Now, knight d2 check is not possible to win the rook because white can simply block the check with the move f3, and you cannot take the rook on f1 because your queen would be hanging, and this would be winning for white. So instead, black decided to keep the battery by playing the move queen to b7 and potentially threatening the move knight d2. White replied with rook to c3. White does not mind giving up the material on f1 because he believes that the position of the king, together with the passive pieces black has, should be enough for a win. And white is completely winning in this position indeed. Black played the move queen e4, And white replied with f4 after a significant think. In this position, white had around 13 minutes, and after the move f4, white had only 7 minutes. And just to remind for the time control, it's 2 hours and plus 30 seconds per move. So it's 120 minutes and 30 seconds per move. So time pressure is definitely a big thing, big part of the time control, especially when there is no second time control. So white opted for the queen trade since they don't want to allow any rook to d2 kind of motifs. So queen c4 check, queen takes c4, rook takes c4, and c5 was played. White maybe have lost the winning advantage. White is still winning, but not as big as it was before. And with significant time pressure kicking in, the mistakes might actually be more common in these types of situations with less time on the clock. White is bringing the king. f5 was played, trying to get the pawns rolling. b3, a move kind of consolidating and probably aiming at these kinds of moves. Knight b4, bishop went to c1, bishop to g5, knight to d6. Position is completely winning. White goes bishop f4. Bishop b2 could have been maybe slightly bit better, but bishop f4 is still completely winning. Knight went to c6 and knight b5. This was the final slip from white. In this position, a move like rook e3 with a big nuance, with the ideas of potentially playing the move knight e4 to trade this bishop off and then push the pawns in the future. So knight b5 was the critical mistake that allowed knight to d4, f6, king f7. And once these knights were traded, this pawn is not going too far. And Fabi tried to make something out of it, but at the end of the day, Wesley defended the position very well. White cannot take this pawn because of the rook e2 check. So king went to f3, but after some simplifications, the game ended in a draw after a threefold repetition. It was a very, very exciting draw. Both players fought till the last second, and it was really close for Fabiano Caruana to go 2 out of 2 and lead the tournament. But with the draw, he is not able to have a sole lead. He is indeed sharing the lead with Gukesh, which we will see his game later. The next game was played between Deac Bogdan Daniel and Anish Giri. Deac, playing with the white pieces, goes for knight f3, d5, c4, knight f6. And this is the second Slav of the round. And Deac plays the move knight c3 as opposed to the exchange Slav. He goes for the mainline Slav, to which Anish replies with d takes c4. a4, bishop f5, e3, e6. This is all pretty standard theory. Queen e2, bishop went down to g6, knight e5, knight d7, takes. Both sides were playing this part of the game very, very quickly. Rook d1, queen c7, bishop d2, rook d8, h3. This is the first long think of the game. From the white side, knight b6, bishop drops back, a5, making sure that this bishop is solid on b4 in case some knight b5 discoveries happened. Queen d3, queen e7, rook c1, improving the pieces, shuffling around a little bit. Rook d7, black goes g5, maybe trying to create something on the king side with g4. Bishop b4, queen b4, knight d2, trying to create something, but queen c5 came in, offering the queens to be off the board just in case. Queens were swapped, rook a8, king f1, bringing the king. Both sides are improving their pieces. Knight f3, knight e4, rook g4. Repetition possible, but white breaks the repetition. If he played rook g5, knight e4 could force the repetition, but white is indeed slightly better, so he is trying to achieve a little bit more. Bunch of trades happened. White goes e4, trying to go e5. Try to open up the position. Knight f8, very clever move, stopping any rook h7 ideas. Rook went to f4, attacking the pawn. Knight h6, defending. Bishop c2. Rook d8, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. g4. offering some more trades. Black is just shuffling around. b5, and maybe black has some chances now, trying to open up the queen side, especially with white having significant time trouble at the moment. It was 1.5 minutes versus 10 minutes. Black actually started piling up on the b file, putting pressure on the f2 pawn, and a couple of repeating moves, and that's how the game ended. So black was like, okay, I don't think I can put pressure on this at this point, because white has a pressure on the c6 pawn. The knight is kind of out of the game, so Anish was okay with the draw, and that was the end of the game. Our next battle was between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Gukesh. This was the longest game of the round, which went on for a very, very long time. And so let's go straight into the action. So it was a Ruy Lopez with an early bishop c5 and a knight ge7. So we can see that Gukesh is actually playing slightly offbeat line against Nepo, maybe trying to avoid some preparation and getting a maybe double-edged position out of the opening. Both sides are developing their pieces, and white takes here with the knight. Usually in these pawn structures, white takes with the pawn, but that would allow black to play this move d6 to d5. That would strike the center, and perhaps after takes, white would be left with an isolated pawn, which is completely fine in this position. But white decided to go knight takes d4, trying to play maybe moves like knight e6 in the future, also trying to play moves like queen h5 as well, trying to maybe exert pressure on the king side. Black plays the move d5 nevertheless, and white drops the knight back to c2. Black takes on e3, knight takes e3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, and the move b6. So now that the position is opened up a little bit, white has a very good attacking possibility. In this position, white played the move queen to c2, but it would have been very interesting if white played the move queen h5, with the idea of bringing the rook to d1 and the bishop to c2 to exert some big pressure on the king side. In this position, black can respond with knight f4, attacking the queen, but the white queen can retreat, attacking the knight on f4, as well as attack the rook on a8, potentially after a discovery. So if knight d3 happens, white can play the move knight g3 and sacrificing the rook for now. But if you take my rook, I will take your rook, putting pressure on this knight on e1. And after bishop d7, I can just play rook e d1, putting pressure on the d file. But this was not played. It would have been interesting if Jan decided to play queen h5, but he played the move queen c2 after some think. Rook d1 was here nevertheless, and then c4 was played. Black played queen c6, putting pressure on this diagonal, to which white replied with knight d5, and that led to a huge trade. White played d6. More pieces were chopped off the board, and one would expect this endgame to end in a very quick draw because the position is getting more or less simplified, but both players played this position for a very long time. Jan was pressing and pressing, and just to give like a very brief analysis on this, they played this position for a very long time. White actually played the 3 versus 3 because he has the bishop. If the bishop and knight were not on the board, this game would have been agreed to a draw extremely quickly, but white was able to get this nice pawn structure versus the h and f pawns, and therefore played this on for a very long time. And also Gukesh was less than 1 minute. He had less than 1 minute. So there was all the reasons for Jan to keep pressing and pressing. So after some shuffling, eventually what ended up happening was they just kept going, and eventually white actually managed to win a pawn after all of the complications. However, that pawn was not enough for white to win, because black kept on attacking the bishop, threatening to simply take the bishop off the board and have a very well-known theoretical draw in the rook endgame. And therefore, white didn't even bother trying it, just made some repetition, and the game ended in a draw like that, peacefully. The last game we're going to be looking at is going to be between Praggnanandhaa and MVL. Prag goes e4, MVL responds with c5, and he goes knight c6. So MVL does not go for his usual Najdorf variation. He instead goes knight c6, going into a Rossolimo instead. Bishop g7, bishop c6, and takes with the b pawn. So when you take with the b pawn, it's a little bit more sharper as opposed to the taking with the d pawn. So MVL shows that he wants to play possibly for more with the black pieces. E5, c3, knight f6, d4, take, castles e5, knight d5, knight c3, take, d5. A little sharp position, but not very sharp indeed. Black has the bishop pair, but white has all the development and putting pressure on this c6 pawn, knight d4, knight b3, and white allowed this move d4 to land, which forced a couple of trades, and at the end white is up a pawn, but that is going to be somewhat temporary as black managed to activate the bishops, which eventually led to a repetition later in the game. So queens were off, white repeated once, couple of times to gain some time, but there is enough compensation for the given pawn in this game, and not too much has happened because black is, although down a pawn, the bishop pair is doing a good enough job of blocking everything, and simply the game ended in a peaceful draw. Solid hold by MVL. White did seem to have slight press, but the bishop pair did its job, making sure that everything was held together. So those were the games of today's round. Very exciting games. Alireza with the only victory, but we had some really entertaining games which could have gone with victories to a couple other players, especially for Fabi. That would have helped him gain an early lead in the tournament, early sole lead in the tournament, but instead he is currently tied for first with Gukesh. And then there is a pack of players tied for third. Wesley So, Jan Nepomniachtchi, MVL, Anish, Prag, and Firouzja joining the pack, sharing the third place. And we also have a tie at the bottom of the table between Deac Bogdan Daniel and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. So these matchups were extremely exciting, and tomorrow we will also be having very exciting matchups. Nodirbek at the bottom of the table will be playing with Fabi with the white pieces. So this is his opportunity to make a comeback and with the white pieces. We have an all-French matchup. We have the MVL versus Alireza. MVL playing with the white pieces. We have an all-Indian matchup. We have Gukesh versus Prag. Gukesh playing with the white pieces. And then we have Anish versus Nepo and Wesley So versus Deac Bogdan Daniel. The matchups are going to be extremely exciting tomorrow. So hopefully I will see you all in the live action and in the recap. So thank you for watching and see you all tomorrow.